The case began like most of Casper Graves' investigations with a cryptic letter. The envelope had no return address, just his name scrawled in jagged black ink. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellowed at the edges and brittle to the touch. Bearing only a few words, the children's voices still linger. Hollow Pines Orphanage, 6 miles north. Casper had read it twice, his practiced eyes scanning the handwriting, looking for clues. The uneven pressure of the pen strokes suggested a shaking hand, perhaps from fear. The paper smelled faintly of damp wood, a scent that brought memories of abandoned places he'd visited in the past. Whoever had sent it clearly didn't want to be found, but they knew about him, knew his reputation for digging into the kinds of mysteries that most people avoided. Casper's first step was research. Hollow Pines Orphanage had been closed for more than 50 years. Officially, it was due to insufficient funding and structural decay. But there were darker rumors hidden in old news clippings and whispered oral accounts from the older townsfolk. Stories of sudden illnesses, staff members disappearing without a trace, and chillingly, the unexplainable vanishing of 5 children over the course of a single week. The last headmistress, Madame Ilara, had written a frantic letter to the town council shortly before the orphanage was shuttered, pleading for help with an unspecified situation. The letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, and Madame Ilara herself was never seen again. As Casper dug deeper, he found accounts of strange lights in the woods surrounding the property. As well as a chilling detail, the other children at the orphanage reported seeing shadows playing with the missing kids before they disappeared. These weren't the fanciful tales of frightened children. The same descriptions appeared over and over shadows that moved on their own, reaching out like living things. But the most curious piece of evidence was a photograph, taken years before the orphanage closed. It was a grainy black and white image of the chapel interior taken during one of the orphanage's Sunday services. In the background, near the edge of the photo, was a faint outline, something dark, humanoid, but indistinct. To an untrained eye, it might have been a trick of the light, but Casper recognized it immediately. He'd seen shapes like that before in other cases, always in places where fear and suffering had taken root. The letter, combined with the disturbing history, convinced him to take the case. The truth was, Casper wasn't just motivated by curiosity. He had a personal stake in uncovering what was going on. His younger sister had vanished under similar circumstances years ago, leaving nothing behind but a toy bear and stories of something in the shadows. Every case he worked was, in part, an effort to find answers for her disappearance, a puzzle he couldn't leave unsolved. As he packed his gear, Casper reviewed the evidence again, mentally preparing himself for whatever awaited him at Hollow Pines. He'd handled hauntings, curses, and plenty of old-fashioned crimes, but something about this case unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The whispers of children, the vanishing kids, the eerie markings described in the old reports, it all pointed to something far darker than a simple haunting. Hollow Pines wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten, buried by time and silence, as if the town itself wanted to erase its existence. That, more than anything else, convinced Casper that this was no ordinary mystery. Something or someone had gone to great lengths to hide the truth. As his car rumbled along the dirt road leading to the orphanage, the outline of the building emerged from the morning mist. It loomed like a monolith, its stone facade scarred by time and neglect. The closer he got, the heavier the air became, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories pressing down on him. By the time he reached the gates, the sun had disappeared behind thick clouds, casting the world in a muted grey. And so, armed with his journal, his flashlight, and a resolve as solid as the scars he carried. Casper stepped onto the grounds of Hollow Pines Orphanage. Whatever secrets it held, he would find them, because in his line of work, shadows were never just shadows, and whispers never stayed silent for long. Casper Graves had a knack for finding trouble, or rather, trouble had a way of finding him. As a private investigator, he took on the kinds of cases that others wouldn't touch. Missing persons, strange occurrences, things that didn't quite fit into the neatly ordered boxes of ordinary life. The old orphanage at the edge of Hollow Pines was exactly that kind of case. The building had been abandoned for decades, but its shadow loomed over the town. People spoke of it in hushed tones, as if saying its name too loudly might draw its attention. There were rumors of voices echoing in empty halls, of lights flickering in windows where there shouldn't be any, of children's laughter drifting through the woods long after dark. Casper had heard it all before, and while most would dismiss it as local superstition, he knew better. Stories like these usually had a kernel of truth, buried somewhere beneath the layers of fear and exaggeration. The orphanage itself was a monument to neglect. Its stone walls were weathered and crumbling, vines crawling up the sides like nature's attempt to reclaim it. The windows were shattered, jagged shards of glass catching the pale moonlight. The air around the building felt different, heavier, colder, as if the structure itself was alive and breathing, watching Casper as he approached. He pushed open the rusted iron gates, which groaned loudly in protest, and stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the front doors. Each step felt like a descent into another world, one where the rules of reality bent and twisted. As he reached the entrance, a chill ran down his spine. It wasn't just the cold. It was the kind of feeling he had learned to trust over the years, the sense that something was very wrong. The front doors creaked open under his touch, revealing a grand foyer that had long since fallen into ruin. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, catching the beam of his flashlight. The once polished floors were now warped and splintered, littered with debris. Faintly, in the distance, he thought he heard a sound, a faint scuffling, like footsteps on the upper floor. He paused, listening, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Casper moved cautiously through the orphanage, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The deeper he went, the stranger things became. The wallpaper peeled away in long, jagged strips, revealing strange symbols etched into the wood beneath. They weren't random. They had a pattern, a purpose, though he couldn't quite decipher their meaning. The air grew colder with each step, and a faint hum began to build, so low it was almost imperceptible but impossible to ignore. The nursery was the first room he entered. It was exactly as he had imagined, rows of tiny beds, most of them overturned or broken, their mattresses shredded. Toys were scattered across the floor, some of them so old and deteriorated they were barely recognizable. A rocking chair sat in the corner, its dark wood gleaming faintly in the flashlight beam. It wasn't moving, but Casper had the distinct feeling that it wanted to. He crossed the room to inspect the far wall, where the symbols were etched even deeper, as if someone or something had been frantic to leave a message. Before he could take a closer look, the temperature dropped sharply, and the faint hum grew louder, turning into a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the very walls. Casper turned sharply, shining his flashlight across the room, but there was nothing there. Just the chair, still and silent, waiting. The further he ventured, the more the orphanage seemed to close in around him. The hallways were impossibly long, stretching and twisting in ways that made no sense. Doors appeared where there hadn't been any before, leading to rooms that shouldn't exist. In one, he found a dining hall, the long table still set with plates and silverware, though they were covered in thick layers of dust. The chandeliers above swayed gently, even though there was no breeze. He didn't notice it at first, but the shadows were moving. Not the way shadows normally do, shifting with the angle of the light, but on their own, sliding along the walls and ceilings like liquid darkness. They were subtle at first, small and fleeting, but as he descended into the lower levels of the orphanage, they became bolder, more defined. They stretched toward him, coiling like tendrils, retreating just out of reach whenever he turned his flashlight on them. The basement was where the real horror began. The stairwell leading down seemed endless, the steps uneven and damp, the air so cold it burned his lungs. The symbols were everywhere now, carved deep into the stone walls, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The hum had turned into a low, pulsating rhythm, like a heartbeat, echoing in time with his own. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a massive chamber that shouldn't have existed. The walls were lined with strange machinery, rusted and broken, their purpose unclear. In the center of the room stood a large circle carved into the floor, filled with intricate patterns and markings. It pulsed faintly, as if alive, and the shadows seemed to pour from it, their movements erratic and frenzied. Casper couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. Something moved behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The air seemed to ripple, and a faint, childlike laugh echoed through the chamber, sending a shiver down his spine. He stepped closer to the circle, his boots crunching on the debris-strewn floor. And that's when he saw it. Beneath the marking, barely visible, were bones. Dozens of them, maybe more, arranged in a deliberate pattern. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a sacrifice. The shadows grew bolder, their tendrils reaching closer, and the chamber began to shake. The markings on the floor flared to life, bathing the room in a sickly, pale light. Casper knew he had to act fast. He rummaged through his bag, pulling out tools he had learned to carry on cases like this: chalk, salt, a weathered journal filled with old rites and incantations. He didn't fully understand what he was dealing with, but he didn't need to. He just needed to survive. The ritual was chaotic, the air filled with the sound of children's cries, guttural growls, and the sharp crack of splintering wood. The shadows fought back, lashing out violently, their tendrils slamming into the walls and floor with enough force to shake the entire building. Casper held his ground, shouting the incantation as the markings on the floor grew brighter, the light pushing back the darkness inch by inch. Finally, with one last guttural scream, the shadows recoiled, collapsing into the center of the circle. The light flared, blinding him, and then silence. The hum was gone. The air was still. The orphanage was quiet. When Casper emerged into the dawn light, his clothes were torn, his hands shaking, but he was alive. The whispers were gone, the shadows banished, and the orphanage stood empty once more. He knew the darkness wasn't gone forever. It never was, but for now it was contained, and that was enough.